Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Reducing the Risk, Part 2. I am Euclid Rosales Yuxi, Library Technical Assistant at the Preservation and Conservation Laboratory, Heritage Library Division, NALIS. We ask you to keep your cameras off and your mics muted. You are invited to type your questions into the chat for the question and answer segment at the end of the webinar. Let me introduce our facilitator, Danielle Fraser. Since 2009, Danielle has been the library conservator and head of the PAC lab. Danielle holds a Master of Science in Information Studies and a Certificate of Advanced Studies in Conservation of Library and Archival Materials from the University of Texas at Austin. She was a 2008 Conservation Fellow of the Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. She has been a member of the American Institute for Conservation and the Library Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Danielle enjoyed presenting papers at the annual meetings of regional associations, including ACRIL and CORAL. So I know she's looking forward to presenting today. Over to you, Danielle.
Thank you so much, Euclid. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before we get into our topic, let me introduce you to our organization. The National Library and Information System Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, NALIS, is the country's coordinator of all library and information services. Beyond the Heritage Library, there are over 25 public libraries, 3 libraries in correctional institutions, libraries in secondary and primary schools, and special libraries in several government agencies, all administered by NALIS. Please visit our website, www.nalis.gov.tt, for more information about our services. We'll post the link in the chat of this webinar. One of NALIS's key responsibilities is to promote and preserve national heritage information. Though the National Library has a comprehensive collection of paper-based items and electronic audiovisual media, there is particular emphasis on materials with national and Caribbean origin, focus, and authorship. The Heritage Library Division, located on the 2nd floor of the National Library Building, Port of Spain, Trinidad, helps NALIS fulfill the goal of acquiring, promoting, and preserving national heritage information. I invite you to follow the Heritage Library Division on Facebook at NALIS HLDTT. See the link in the chat. Special collections acquired or donated to the Heritage Library Division consist of mainly traditional library items created by or of interest to a significant person or organization of Trinidad and Tobago. One would not be surprised to find within these collections books, newspapers, pamphlets, letters, photographs, film and audio recordings, and even memorabilia like the typewriter you see here. The Preservation and Conservation Laboratory is responsible for ensuring the overall longevity of library materials with attention to the Heritage Library Division and its collection of historical importance. The PAC Lab, which was officially commissioned in 2013, helps NALIS fulfill its role as the International Federation and Library Associations and Institutions, IFLA, Preservation and Conservation Regional Center for the English-speaking Caribbean. Additionally, this arm of the Heritage Library Division advises public and private organizations on the care of their collections and artifacts. The PAC Lab has been serving the preservation needs of clients through fumigation, freeze drying, conservation treatments, collection repair, bindery services, disaster recovery, technical assistance, and preservation training. We miss carrying out our preservation clinics, tours, and training sessions in person. However, we are happy that technology allows us to continue this mission through our preservation webinar series. In case you missed any of our previous webinars, the link to the YouTube playlist on the NALIS channel is posted in the chat. So, as we think of protecting our library and archival collections, we began part 1 of this series on reducing the risk with risk assessment. We'll take a quick look back at key aspects from part 1. In this part 2 of the series, we will look at measures for risk mitigation. We will explore what we can do to eliminate the sources of risk, create barriers between our collections and the risk, or act on the risk directly, if possible, through stages of control and layers of control. So let's begin. Now, in part 1, we explored what puts our collections at risk. We understand that the 10 agents of deterioration are the primary threats or hazards to our library and archival collections. The Agents of Deterioration framework was developed by the Canadian Conservation Institute, CCI, in the 1990s, and it has been widely adopted and expanded. Just to remind you that the 10 agents of deterioration are physical forces, fire, water, criminals, pests, pollutants or contaminants, light and UV, incorrect temperature, incorrect humidity, and neglect and dissociation. Each agent is a grouping of hazards which can impact cultural heritage collections. Each can bring different levels of risk to our collections. We also understood that damage and loss will only occur if our collections are both susceptible and exposed to the agent of deterioration. That's when the item will be affected. This is an important concept to note, as risk mitigation can include acting on the agent of deterioration, reducing the collection's exposure to the agent of deterioration, and that's going to be the red area, or reducing its susceptibility to the agent of deterioration, and that's the blue area. Now, in part 1, we also understood that when assessing risk to our library and archival collections, we should seek to answer these 3 questions. 1, what might happen? What hazard or agent of deterioration has a likelihood of affecting or damaging the collection? 2, how likely is it? What is the chance or the possibility of it actually happening? And what will be the frequency of this occurrence? And 3, what will be the consequences? What will be the expected impact on our collections? And how severe would this harm be? These questions form the framework for most of the risk assessment tools which work well for library and archival collections. Here are a few risk assessment tools developed for cultural heritage collections based on the framework of the 10 agents of deterioration. Using these tools will help you determine the magnitude, and then you'll be able to prioritize the various risks to your collections. Now, though this risk management approach described by Robert Waller is tailored to natural history museum collections, I think it can be effectively applied to the protection of all types of cultural heritage. And he says in a paper that he wrote about it, after all risks to a collection have been identified and their magnitude quantified or at least estimated. And I want to say here, that's exactly what we do when we carry out risk assessment that we spoke about in part 1. Then risk mitigation can be explored. There are 3 basic means of mitigating a risk. He goes on to describe them. 1, eliminate the source of the risk. 2, establish a barrier. And 3, act on the agent responsible for the risk. Now, Waller suggests applying these means of control to mitigate significant risk to collections. And we could sort of put the controls into 5 general thoughts, 5 general stages of control, let's call it that. And we look at them as a mix of preventative and reactive measures for reducing the risk to our library and archival collections. Waller suggests that you first avoid the cause of the risk, then block the agent of deterioration. This may include putting a barrier between the agent of deterioration and the collection. Then detect and respond should always go together. We should detect or monitor the agents of deterioration and their effects on the collection, and then respond effectively and quickly whenever a problem is detected. Finally, we can recover from the damages or losses caused to our collection. Now, he goes on to advise that each of the means of control should be considered at each of the 8 possible levels of control. And I want you to think of it as moving from the most exterior to the most interior level. We have location or region, then the site, building, room, cabinet or storage, specimen or item, and policy and procedure. Now, location or region may only be possible before the construction phase, at which point you should select a location which reduces the effect of natural and human-induced hazards. Now, modifications to your site, building, and facilities can greatly impact your risk mitigation strategies. Issues with the exterior of your building often results in damage to the interior. For instance, clogged gutters and drains can lead to recurring problems of roof leaks or wall condensation. Do not underestimate the value of protection which cabinets and storage furniture, as well as object-level housing or protective enclosures, can provide against several hazards. In fact, well-positioned storage can help optimize safe access and retrieval. For example, keeping furniture 4 to 6 inches off the floor can help avoid water damage. Also, preservation quality housing materials provide storage support and can also act as a barrier to water, pest, dust, light, and fluctuations in relative humidity. Now, risk can also be prevented or mitigated by implementing policies and procedures to guide on all collection management practices. We're talking from acquisition and intellectual controls to preservation and digitization, all the way right through. Now, effective mitigation of each risk may require application of one or several of the stages of control, as well as the layers of control. Now, ICROM, in their risk management guide, suggested this table to help us think about all the possible options in a systematic way. Now, at each layer of control, right, location, site, building, we can think about the action or the stage of control we could put in place. Now, of course, it's not always going to be possible to fill each and every spot for each agent of deterioration. But I think this matrix works well as a tool for helping us widen the way we think of risk mitigation. So let's do some brainstorming. We'll look at some scenarios for some of the agents of deterioration. Let's start with physical forces. Let's say, in this scenario, a strong earthquake can cause toppling of collections, resulting in damage, right? Any suggestions as to how we can mitigate this risk? We can't avoid an earthquake, but we can put something in place to block the damaging effect of an earthquake, or perhaps, what can we do? What layer of control can we mitigate against this risk? Can we look at the building or perhaps storage? What are your ideas? Feel free to share them in the chat. Now I'll get the ball rolling, and maybe you might be thinking of some of these. We can make changes at the room or storage layer of control. Securing storage shelves to walls, ceilings, and floors can prevent them from toppling over during an earthquake, right? So this is a way of avoiding. So just to go back to our matrix that was suggested by ICROM, you see here that the suggestion I had there comes within here. Considering the room and the cabinets or the storage, we're looking at an idea for blocking this particular physical force, this particular agent of deterioration. Great. Now, here's another one. What about accidental damage to a collection item from being dropped or physically mishandled during use? Any suggestions as to how we can mitigate this risk? Feel free to put your suggestions in the chat. How do we mitigate against this risk of accidental physical damage from a collection item during use, perhaps being mishandled or dropping on the floor, etc.? How do we restrict this? Great. And I see someone saying restrict access. That's an interesting one. Now, what I suggested was that we could implement training and instructions for using the collection to prevent accidental or physical damage. A lot of times, and the damage might actually even come from staff even. So if staff are not trained as to how to handle and care for our library and archival collections, we can have damage going on. Now remember, yes, restricting access is one of those options as well. So my suggestion, as well as that one on restricting access, can come with respect to policy and procedure, or perhaps with the collection item itself. But of course, we want our collections to be accessed by as many persons as possible, to be used and seen by several, to be involved in their research. So I would suggest a lot of times restriction is not fully possible depending on what we want to do. Now, of course, if it's a very brittle material, you can actually opt to use protective enclosures. I see someone mentioning that in order to protect them while they're being handled. This could include using sleeves for very brittle maps or documents so that somebody can handle them in the sleeve, but they're not directly handling and touching the item. Now, if we're restricting access to the physical item, we ought to be allowing for access in another form as well. So that would mean allowing for digital copies to be available as well. So let's move to another one, still in physical forces. What if there was poor storage support of collection items? For instance, example, pamphlets, which could cause them to bend or distort over time. They're not sitting down properly on the shelf. They're not supported on the shelf. Is there any suggestion as to how we can mitigate against this risk? Can we use the avoid or block stage of control? Do we do it at the storage level of control, or perhaps at the item layer of control? What options do we consider? And I see here someone saying that you can use book supports. And that's exactly in line with what I suggested. Improve the storage enclosures of collection items to help reduce the distortion that goes on during storage. And just to put this in the matrix, you see here that it is sort of in the avoid block aspect, right? So we're preventing that distortion by putting something in place on the layer of cabinet or storage, that layer of control. Yeah. Now here's another one. Let's say that our library or archive is in an area prone to forest or bush fires. So we're looking at the agent of deterioration, fire. So we have a very high risk of severe seasonal fires causing fire damage or even destroying our collection building. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can mitigate this risk? What stage of control can we consider? Do we block, avoid, detect, respond? Are there things we can do to the site, the building, the room, or the storage layer of control? Any ideas on mitigating against the risk of fire? Right, and we're thinking we have a location where there's a high risk of severe seasonal forest fires, possibly destroying our building or maybe even just causing some fire damage, smoke, etc. What do we do? What are some of the possible things that we can do? Great, and I see some suggestions coming in. We can consider installing a fire suppression system, ensuring that we have no landscaping close to the building, that your exterior is made of concrete, that you have a metal roof, that you move the location of the collection, especially valuable items. And these are all excellent suggestions. Let me share with you some that I came up with, just thinking on it and sort of brainstorming. So we have at the site level, I agree that we can clear trees, brush, grass, anything like that that could possibly be ignited from around the building in those high-risk areas. Or within the building and in our collection rooms, we can install fire detection, fire alarm, and fire suppression systems. And at the level of procedure, we can train staff in fire prevention and evacuation methods to be carried out in case of a fire. And by training staff, we're not looking only at, and it's very important, saving life, but if it's possible to quickly evacuate the collections when there's a major fire going on, or move with the most precious or the top priority items. You can train staff on how those evacuation procedures should go. So this one, you had more of a range. I had suggested things that you can do on the site layer, right? Avoid and block. There are options that you can do for the building and room layer of control. We can have the blocking, right? Fire suppression, fire detection. We can have the detect as well, those fire alarms, etc. And then the response, should a fire happen, something to actually suppress the fire. And then I mentioned that we can do policy and procedure things in order to help avoid and block. Right, so we got a little bit more on the matrix for this one. Now let's consider the agent of deterioration, water. What if, and this is the scenario I'm giving, what if a faulty air conditioning unit leaked water onto collection items that were shelved below? Any suggestions as to how we can mitigate against this risk? What stage of control can we consider? Do we avoid? Do we block, perhaps detect? Do we just simply respond and recover? What are some of the options we can do for this medium level sort of risk, the chance that a faulty air conditioning unit leaking water onto our collection items? Any idea? Perhaps you might agree with some that I suggested. Now, there's one obvious control at the avoid stage that just might not be possible. Fix the AC, right? We think of it in a very simple manner, but perhaps because the ownership and the maintenance of the building is out of the control of the library of the archive, or maybe it's something that's too expensive to undertake at this time, and so it has to be budgeted and scheduled down the road. However, we can put other measures in place to reduce the impact of the risk. We can reposition the shelving away from the AC unit. So that's an aspect of just avoid, the avoid control stage of dealing with this risk. Move the items away from where the risk is happening. but maybe the move might not be possible. So perhaps we might have shelves that are bolted into place. They're permanently fixed in their location. Maybe because of the whole earthquake story, we would have fixed them to the walls, the ceilings, and the walls, etc. So that may not be possible. So maybe we may have to go to that level of being ready to respond, being prepared with tarpaulins and plastic sheetings to cover the collection should something happen with that AC unit. So looking at avoid and block at the cabinet and the collection level, cabinet storage or the collection item level. Now here's one looking at vandalism or criminal activity as an agent of deterioration. Here's a scenario. What if one of our users deliberately vandalizes a book by tearing out and stealing pages? Any suggestions on how we can mitigate this risk? Can we use the detect or respond stage of control? Do we do it at the room or policy layer of control? Any ideas, any suggestions as to what could be possible? How do we deal with this relatively low level? A person tearing out and stealing a book, a page from a book, right? A lot of times this tends to happen with our very nice magazines or perhaps even textbooks that might be very hard to get. Unfortunately, we have a lot of users who are selfish in that regard, and so they do the option of tearing out instead of copying or scanning or using those things. Unfortunately, they go the route of vandalizing the book. So it's something that could be possible. But how do we go about mitigating this risk? Any suggestions? I see someone saying provide free access to copiers and scanners. And also we have another suggestion, policy control, staff to be more vigilant at the circulation desk. All very, very great mitigating measures. Here are a couple that I came up with. At the room or layer, at the room layer of control, we can install security cameras in the reading rooms or in the areas where the collections are being accessed. It's been proven that surveillance equipment can be a deterrent to criminals and vandals. Now, you can also implement a policy to help restrict the items that people actually bring with them while they're accessing your library or archive. So you can restrict bags and personal effects, and those things allow for stolen items to be easily hidden and moved off of the compound. So by restricting, preventing the entry with bags and personal effects, that's also another method. So let me show you in the matrix where these things sort of hang out. So I spoke about the cameras. So that's an aspect of block, as well as detect, picking up when vandalism should happen. And because we have the cameras, we're able to respond and perhaps approach someone, right? So it kind of goes on these three squares. And then that aspect of developing that policy goes by way of avoid and block. We stop the possibility of it happening by restricting what people can actually come into the space with. I see someone mention here, create a proper log, an in and out for users and personnel of the library to do a quick review with the person borrowing the materials exactly, or to track and log who has access at which particular time and of which materials. And that's something that definitely would come in very handy as a policy to allow for both, I think both avoid, block, and detect. Yeah. That would work well in this category of the matrix. Excellent. So here's another scenario with mitigating risk of pest. Medium level risk, termites. What if we found termites, which can weaken wooden building structures and objects? Do you have any suggestions as to how we can mitigate this risk? What stage of control can we consider? Do we avoid, block, detect, or respond? What could be an option for dealing with this problem of having termites present in our collections or in our building? Right. I see someone suggested have regular spraying of the area, and that's exactly the suggestion that I made. We can choose a control on the building or site level where we can have regular chemical pest treatments of the area and the building for termites, right? So excellent. And just to give you a sense of where this falls within the matrix, we're looking at the site and building level. And it's an aspect of avoiding having termites as well as blocking the presence of termites. So usually those treatments are one that would help repel termites from coming onto the areas that are treated, as well as it will treat and kill those that are actually there currently. Yeah. So say we have sunlight streaming through windows and reaching our collection items, and over time causing them to fade or to bleach. And I put this as a low-level risk because it's one that's going to happen over a longer space of time. And the damage is not severe, but it is still damage that's going on with our collection. So how do we deal with this? Any suggestions as to how we can mitigate this risk of light and UV damage? Can we use the detect or respond stage of control? Do we do it at the room layer of control, or do we consider the item layer of control? What are some of your suggestions? Great. I see a lot of suggestions coming in. One person suggested install blinds or curtains, tint the windows. Yes, blinds or curtains and tint the windows. And great, that's actually one of the recommendations that I was suggesting here for the room layer of control. We can actually do an action of blocking the light by installing shades or blinds. So we're going the option of blocking the agent of deterioration. At the storage item, the storage or item level of control, we can place the collections that are at risk of fading into well-fitting archival quality protective enclosures. So let's take a quick look where we fall within the matrix. That aspect of the blinds would be at the room layer of control, and it would help us avoid the light damage and block any light damage that's happening. And the suggestion of using a protective enclosure is on the collection item level of control, and it's again looking at avoid and block. Great, I think we're doing wonderful. Now here's our final scenario. Let's look at the agent of deterioration, dissociation. And it's one that sometimes is a little bit difficult to understand, but dissociation refers to anything that causes the loss of information as it relates to the collection items. So most of the information about our collections tend to be stored digitally if we have a very large collection. So it might be that we have our inventory, our catalog, the provenance research for archival collections, contractual agreements, copyright and intellectual agreements or information. All of these things are stored sometimes digitally. Now, what if that digital system failed and we lost all of it? Any suggestions as to how we can mitigate against this risk? What stage of control can we consider? What options can we consider for this? And I see here we have ensure that the information is placed on a secondary drive. Yes, someone is saying restrict the use and backup servers that are off-site. Exactly. Wonderful. That's one of my suggestions there. Keep backup copies of the information. We can avoid losing this information by doing just that. Or we might be able to recover the digital data from the damaged hard drive or the server, right? And I want to show where those two, so one being avoiding the dissociation from happening, that loss of information about our collections by putting policies and procedures in place. And we could also have policies and procedures ready for should it happen to go about recovering, right? We may have to actually employ someone's skill and a vendor in order to carry out that recovery of the item itself. Now, I hope that these scenarios really got you thinking on risk mitigation measures and thinking of it in this whole matrix and seeing that it's not as intimidating an exercise to do. You can think of, once you've identified all of the risks that affect your collection, you can then think of it in this matrix to figure out what are some of the possible mitigating measures that can be put in place to help reduce the risk, right? And so we can look at it for each agent of deterioration and at each layer of control from location, site, building, room, all the way down to procedure, and looking at each of these. Now, like I said, if you use that matrix using the stages of control, the avoid, block, detect, respond, and recover, against the layers of control from location or region to site, building or room, to storage or item, to policy or procedure, you may end up with so many different options for mitigating the risk against each agent of deterioration acting on your collection. So prioritizing or deciding on which options to execute will be your next task. Now, both the guides from ICROM provide great sections to guide you further on this and to really take it and drill it down to a level for your organization. But let me just touch on a few key considerations for selecting the best mitigating options. First off, how much does it reduce the risk? Does it reduce it completely? Do you get just partial reduction? Or is it only by a small amount? And you could really sort of move through the scenario and see, well, okay, yes, we get 100% removal of this risk by implementing that measure, or do we get 50%, 75%? You could gauge it based on the risk and the scenario that's going on in your organization. Now, what about the cost? How much does it cost? Is there an actual capital cost that's needed for implementing it right up front? Or would there be annual repeated costs for operating it? And perhaps even for loan repayments. So for instance, one of the measures we mentioned dealing with pests was for the termite chemical treatments. That actually requires regular treatments to happen every so often. And so you have a recurring operational cost, not just a one-time measure. So for instance, another one that we can think of, maybe looking at installing the blinds or curtains. Those may not be as quick a turnaround as you'll get for having the insect treatment, right? Those blinds or curtains can actually last for a number of years before you having to replace them yet again. So that tends to be considered almost a one-time effort. And does it actually reduce other risks? Does it reduce more than one risk? For example, a protective enclosure, and we mentioned them when we were thinking about light, right? It reduces the risk of light damage, but it also reduces the risk of dust accumulation, the risk of physical damage. It reduces more than one risk by implementing that one single mitigating measure. And I also want you to consider, is it feasible? Not just considering the financial feasibility, but also is it relevant within the laws and regulations of your country, of your organization? Even consider the social and cultural as well as religious aspects of the heritage collection that's involved. So you want to not just only think of finance and the laws and the regulation, but also think of the fact that these cultural heritage items are more than just items. They have a social impact, a cultural impact, and depending on what they are, they may even have some religious aspects to them that you must consider before putting that risk mitigation measure in place. Now, is it sustainable? And sustainability is something that we want to consider, especially as it relates to energy consumption, the environmental aspects, but also by sustainability, I want you to consider as well, what are the continued operating costs? And do you have staffing needs that have to be sustained over a period of time for that particular agent, that particular risk mitigation measure to be implemented? And does it create new risk to the collection? Is it that you're helping mitigate one risk and you bring up another risk that wasn't there before? So let me give you this example. You may go about improving the emergency exits or doors that allow for rapid evacuation in case of emergencies, and that's going to be good. You're going to reduce the risk of something happening should an emergency take place. But that can actually create a new risk of theft as these entryways become more accessible. So these doorways end up becoming more easily accessible from the outside, or perhaps even with someone inside. And so you get that risk, that increased risk of theft, one that you have to consider. So we see that there are a lot of things to think about as we go about selecting what will be our best option. And so, thank you so very much for our webinar. I hope that our look at reducing the risk by mitigating the risk was something that was very helpful to you. Feel free to put your questions in the chat or to email me. We will also add to the chat a link that you can use for downloading the list of resources for mitigating the risk to your collections. You receive an email today. It will have both a brief survey as well as the link for downloading the resources, just in case you missed it here. We'll send that today. And again, remember that your feedback is going to be so important to us. It helps us improve. So we look forward to your responses. And I want you to join us as we end this series on Wednesday, August 25th at 1 p.m. local time with Reducing the Risk Part 3. We will introduce disaster planning for library and archival collections. So when all else we looked at the risks that are possible for our collections in Part 1, right, assessing the risk. Part 2 here, we just finished looking at mitigating those risks. How do we go about reducing them? And then Part 3, as we end our reducing the risk, we're going to look at what disaster planning can you put in place that would help overall reduce the risk that can take the damage that can take place with your collection should a disaster happen. Right? So I do hope that you would join us then. Thank you so very much for your participation. Thank you for all of your comments, all of your suggestions. You guys have been excellent. So we'll take your questions now. Feel free to make any questions or comments. There was one that I think I missed early on. Someone was suggesting gloves. Remember we were saying that what if improper handling was causing the item to be damaged, that physical damaging. And so someone suggested gloves, and I agree with what A. Walker says. A. Walker said gloves are undesirable for book handling because they reduce dexterity and it's more likely to cause you to bend the edges of paper. Gloves generally only help for photos, and that's exactly it. When we did our care and handling webinar, and I hope if you missed that, be sure to go back to the YouTube channel and view it. We spoke about gloves and whether or not gloves are really and truly something that you should have. Yes, for photos, they're really important for photos just because of how susceptible photos are to our fingerprints and the oil and those things that are on our fingers. However, for other items, it's better that you go about washing your hands and that you handle the item with washed hands. Of course, in some scenario, if the material is given off something that can dirty your fingers, for instance, sometimes newspaper clippings tend to be very oily and they may transfer a lot of that and get things messy. In that case, maybe gloves might be something that's beneficial. But we encourage as best as possible washing your hands, because a lot of times dexterity decreases when you are handling with gloves. So I would go ahead and end right here. Thank you so very much for your comments and your questions. Do have a safe and good afternoon. Thank you.